Our speaker tonight is Tracy Reilly Kelly. She's going to be speaking on Clark County historical women, and specifically ones that were involved in the women's suffrage movement. Tracy recently retired from managing the mature learning and community education program at Clark. She was initially a history major. She received her BA in Human Services from the Evergreen State College and a master's in teaching health ed at Portland State. She taught women's health and women's studies at Clark College for 12 years and at Portland State for 4. Currently, she's been teaching a class on British history at Clark's continuing ed program, and she is an enthusiastic genealogist. I think you'll find tonight's program to be very interesting. She created 10 of the 16 Her Story panels that are featured at the Clark County Historical Museum. When we wrote the publicity for this, the museum was closed, but in the last week or so, it has reopened on a limited basis. So sit back and enjoy this program about women's progress and settlement here. Thank you, Tracy.
I am so delighted to be speaking to all of you tonight, and my goodness, I really should join, and I will. I love doing genealogy, and this is certainly a testimony to my grandmother, who is a terrific genealogist, by the way. Oh, what's happening here? I'm trying to advance my slides. Uh-oh, I don't like this. Advance. Oh my goodness sakes. Okay, I don't know, it was slow to do that. Okay, so I'm going to be talking to you about the entire suffrage movement, as well as some things to know about, pardon? Okay, I'm going to be talking to you about the entire suffrage movement, as well as some focus on Washington State and on the women here. What I want to just very enthusiastically tell everyone, and I will put my credentials in the chat at the end, but if you would like a tour, a docent guided tour of the Her Story exhibit at the Clark County Historical Society, I'm in. I was mentioning to a little bit that we have created this and almost nobody has seen it. It's almost like a sand painting or something that you put all of this energy in. And so really a lot about specific Clark County women are inside that exhibit. And I would love to talk with you because I know so much more than this presentation and even the panels, right? So here we were in 2020 celebrating the 100th. My goodness, I don't advance very well here. This is freaking me out, everybody. Why am I not advancing easily? I'm trying to advance my slides and it's like they're frozen. Oh my God. Don't tell me this is how can, no, okay. I don't know why there's a delay, folks, and I'm very sorry about it. Here's one of the first things that I want to talk with you about, and that is suffragist versus suffragette. So when we're talking about the movement that gained women the right to vote, the word suffrage means the right to vote for anyone. And so we are talking about women's suffrage. And when you want to put women down, you would call them a suffragette. That would be like, you're not really a full woman, you're some kind of mini version. And so the word is suffragist. Now, one thing I want to connect with you about, that it's 2021, is a little bit of my musing as to how did the 2020 celebration of women's suffrage go? And it was complicated. Now, first of all, COVID canceled most everything. Can I tell all of you that I'm sure you would have joined me last August, where we would have paraded down Main Street, right? Just like our women before us, all wearing white. So we couldn't do very many activities. You know, nobody saw the exhibit at the History Museum. But also I want to talk with you as we look at all of these slides about what is going on in the US and what is going on with historians and educators and what's going on, right? Which is that an awareness of systemic racism, and this has been ongoing, but was particularly explosive last summer, then called into question how important was the work of suffragists who were mostly white and were very privileged. If they were African American or working women, they probably didn't have very much time in order to work in the movement. So the movement really shows you that it is often one of women who are highly educated and are not in the working world. So as America was looking at the suffrage in general, there was a great emphasis on recognizing Black women. And I'm going to include that with you tonight because that's certainly something that I have been doing all along. Now, the other big question is about voting rights in general. And sometimes I've been hearing people not understand how to describe history because they pick onto some memes or something like that. Of course, the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was passed, and it passed giving all women the right to vote. So you might be hearing phrases and saying, well, the 19th Amendment didn't really give women the right to vote. Well, that's because nor did the 14th Amendment give all men the right to vote, right? So that the intention of giving the vote to persons of color meant that really it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act in 1965 that all people in the United States and those in the South could vote. But the 19th Amendment was passed, and it was passed on June 4th, 1919. And what did it say? Very simply, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So this is how it happens. An amendment is passed, and then it must be passed by 3/4 of the states in the Union. And in 1920, that meant that 36 states needed to ratify. So what were the big issues? And these were certainly issues here in our area. And so I'm gonna talk about them in general, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about Washington State. So an interesting thing went on throughout this movement, which is how can we do this best? Getting votes for women state by state, or a federal amendment that will give all women the right to vote. The reason that the state by state idea was going on was, by the way, that in the South, there was more opposition to women gaining the right to vote than in the North. And again, the thorny subject of racism was part of that, not wanting to give more power to Black women. But the big issues for women have to do with their property and inheritance rights, their ability to have a divorce and gain custody. You understand that all during this time, not only was divorce absolutely unheard of, but if you did divorce, you were unlikely, the woman was unlikely to get custody of her children. The rights of working women are also really interesting as we look into history, right? Because just like history is written by the victors, one of the things that we know is that working women and their labor issues and their rights, you know, are also quite important. The social issues of the day that are going on and have been going on throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century then are, first off, temperance and prohibition. Now, I don't know how much you have been drilling in individually or at the society as a whole, but temperance is a very big issue to women in Clark County. And it is the issue that pushes women and gets them, by the way, even more than suffrage, to be able to get onto a platform and work for something. And I'm going to talk to you quite a bit more about temperance and prohibition. You know, it's very interesting because one concern about men giving women the right to vote was an idea. So if you listen to the antis, they would say, oh my God, don't give women the right to vote because we will have prohibition. You know, oh my God, this is what they will do, right? So don't give them the right to vote. Interestingly, the Prohibition Amendment is passed in 1919. And that one, by the way, is ratified as fast as any amendment in the United States has. It just flew through legislatures. So prohibition, probably not a good idea ultimately, but certainly something that women were thinking about. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. And then obviously class and privilege are going to always be issues throughout this. And racism, voting rights, the Jim Crow era, how is that affecting things? And then nativism, and nativism is a very big issue on the West Coast as well as throughout the country. And the idea of this and why it is used in a very negative manner. And so this gives you a little bit idea about what is wrong with the women of privilege who are working for this. They would be known to say, when they would be up on their soapbox or something like that, can you imagine? We want to give the right to vote to some Italian person who has just come off the boat, you know, can't even speak English, but he's a man, and a woman, a college educated woman, can't get the right to vote. So setting up groups against each other is, of course, an old way of division. But in Washington State, we're very, very progressive. So let's think a little bit about the difference between women on the West Coast, and I would say the Western United States, and women in the Eastern United States. And this is something I'm going to talk to you more about in the next slide, but this is kind of a little fun thing. So here's a little Seattle newspaper, the Votes for Women Gazette. And our state on November 8th, 1910, gave women the right to vote. So our women in Washington State, from 1910 on, voted in national elections. And so let's get a little bit of an idea about what was going on with voting in Washington suffrage. Now, I'm going to jump ahead and mention to you that the great Susan B. Anthony traversed across Washington State a couple of times, but one of those times was in 1872. And that was when the territory was forming. And in the 1870s, for a short period of time, the territory did indeed give women the right to vote. But not at statehood. So then statehood comes in 1889 and forget about it, right? So, but the issue continues in Washington State. It's something in our legislature, by the way, continuously through, and supported by many men, and I will talk about that. And so then after the 19th Amendment is passed and is going through the ratification process, we were the 35th state to ratify. This is kind of interesting little trivia because it's going to happen in August of 1920, and we were the 35th state in March. So that tells you that several states voted not to ratify the amendment by the time it rolled around to the 36th state. So how did it all begin? Well, it's said to have begun the formal suffrage movement in 1848 in Seneca Falls. And here's a little drawing of it, right? Well, what was going on? Well, whether this was the first conference or not, women began to assemble and they liked it. So can I tell you that women assembling through the 19th century for conventions and conferences was absolutely fantastic. When I was doing the exhibit, one of the things I really wanted to try to get in my mind is how often did Vancouver women go down to Portland? Well, they did. They certainly did. And going down to Portland for the day to attend a conference or go to a parade, yes, they did. But who was Susan B. Anthony? So let's just take a short little minute and talk about the woman who did the most for suffrage. She is not there at the 1848 convention. She meets the person who set up that convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in 1851, and she will attend her first convention in Syracuse in 1852. Her first reason to get onto the soapbox, and you remember that people in fact really did get on a box and they put it in the public square and they stood up on it, and they were often carriers of soap. So a soapbox really is something that carried soap, that was very, you know, you could carry it with you and you could stand on it. I think it's very interesting that things created to make Susan Bean Anthony's question in terms of racism, and it's a much more complicated story that I won't tell you about right now, but I will tell you that she was a very strong abolitionist. And Frederick Douglass, who lived in the same town, Rochester, New York, was a dear friend of the Anthony family. But Susan B. Anthony was the real thing. And and she had a lifelong collaboration with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So here is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, interesting that people don't talk about her as much, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the writer, was the #1 writer of women's, you know, the platforms and the essays, and she wrote all of Susan B. Anthony's speeches. And so she has this wonderful quote: "As all women are supposed to be under the thumb of some man, I prefer a tyrant of my own sex, for I believe that I have developed into much more of a woman under Susan's jurisdiction." Susan B. Anthony would even, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had 6 children. So Anthony would come over and even babysit and lock Cady Stanton up in a room upstairs so that she would just write, because she was such a brilliant writer. And then here she is in her later years. Miss Anthony did many things not because they were officially her duty, but because they ought to be done and there was no one else ready to undertake them. She would go anywhere and she would travel under any circumstance. Susan B. Anthony she was not a big eater. She didn't care what she ate. She didn't care how she slept. And what I mean by that is there were many railway stations and cabins and things that she slept in. When she traveled, she liked to be at the top of the coach, or she liked to go down and talk to the railmen. And her method was she would talk with them and she would ask them questions, and then she would start asking them questions about their mother. And as the men started thinking about their mother, and of course that would be the woman that they would say the most fond things about, she would start saying, "Wouldn't your mother have deserved this? And wouldn't your mother have deserved that?" So she was the most fantastic of the imaginable promoters. And then Cady Stanton is also a very brilliant woman, and I feel like she's kind of forgotten to history. And I was just speaking to somebody, oh my goodness, who said their genealogy and they were related to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I don't remember who it was, but I thought, oh, are you lucky? Lucy Stone is another very early worker, and I've got too much to say, too many slides, want to get through it. It's hard for me to know when to stop. But just for fun, I wanted to mention to you that Lucy Stone was the first woman who kept her own name. And she even put this into her marriage vows. Lucy Stone is an important suffragist who absolutely never turned her back on the Black person or on any kind of idea. As the movement goes on, there begins to get problematic dialogue as to whether Black men deserve the vote before all women. And so this is why racism gets involved in here. This woman, Lucy Stone, said, "I don't think that's a good idea. I think we ought to just say that we want to pass the 14th Amendment and women will wait for their time." I'm telling you like there's a whole story and there's a whole chapter I'm not telling you about. But what I do want to tell you is that there are some women who are called Lucy Stoners. And if any of you kept your own maiden name, you're a Lucy Stoner. Just a quickie here. This is what bloomers look like, by the way. This was the shocking idea of dress. And I have to tell you that, you know, these are like, oh, all these women are going to start wearing these wacky clothing. And isn't this interesting? Because this is what bloomers are. It doesn't look all that different from a woman's costume today. Another little bit of trivia. So I'm giving you the back end stories of these things, right? Sojourner Truth did not say, "Ain't I a woman?" and she did not deliver her speech in a slave-oriented dialect. Now, Sojourner Truth was a freed slave, but she lived in upstate New York. And she had a New York accent, and she grew up among, and she, you know, she had a very sophisticated way of speaking. So one of the things that's quite interesting, a revisionist history is so much fun, right? When you also look and see what are the backstories here. Sojourner Truth said, "Aren't I a woman? Not ain't I a woman?" But this is her card. Now, if any of you, I got to tell you an interesting thing. If any of you are collectors, are looking out at old things, many of these speakers would make these cards. Sojourner Truth was one of the great ones of doing this. And so she would carry a whole bunch of these cards, see, with her photo on it and everything, and she would sell them. And that was one of the ways that she supported herself. And so they would have these cards. An important African-American woman to suffrage is Mary Church Terrell, one of the founders of the NAACP. Notice that she certainly looks like a woman of privilege here. Her parents grew up in slavery, but they were part of a very thriving Black and upper class, and her family had gotten a great deal of money. She was affiliated and was involved in suffrage. One of the things that she said that's a powerful thing to think about: a white woman has only one handicap to overcome, that of sex. I have two, both sex and race. Colored men have only one, that of race. Colored women are the only group in this country who have two heavy handicaps to overcome, that of race as well as sex. Another really strong and interesting woman is Ida B. Wells. Now, she was a journalist and lost a friend who was lynched and could not believe it. Was really one of the bravest women that you will ever know of. And she is the person that there is this really great story about. So look at this program. So as I jump around, I have just jumped to 1913. I think I was with Susan B. Anthony in 1851 or something like that. But I want to tell you, I'm jumping all around. And the reason why is because I wanted to tell you about the Black women who were some of the heroes who were involved in suffrage. But there was a lot of racism. And at this very famous 1913 parade, this is held on Pennsylvania Avenue the day before Wilson is inaugurated. Here is their great program. The women say, well, Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell, we need you to walk at the back of the parade. Well, they don't want to walk at the back of the parade. You know, they were part of this, and they were both college-educated women. And during the parade, college-educated women would march together. Well, Ida B. Wells was at the back of the parade at the beginning, but she marched right up to join the Illinois college-educated women and marched in that parade. So Ida B. Wells, what an important woman. Okay, so let's get to our region. So, and I put these slides up, and I've got several of them about Clark County because I wanted to make sure that I kept my time frame here. So Abigail Scott Duniway. Now I imagine that some of you have heard of Abigail Scott Duniway already. She was the most important Northwest suffragist, and really from Oregon. Interesting story. Came across the plains, came on the trail with her family. She settles in sort of near Salem, Oregon, marries, and her husband has a terrible accident. You know, this is the story of our antecedents, our ancestors. One bad accident would be bad for them, so she has to go to work. He becomes really, I don't know exactly what his abilities were, but he was greatly diminished and he could not work. She opens a newspaper, and boy, is she into suffrage. And one of the things she wants to do more than anything else is befriend Susan B. Anthony, and she does that. And she does it because she's just about as remarkable as Susan B. Anthony is. And she is the major person who organizes suffrage in Vancouver, Washington, as well as a great deal of Washington state. She even is involved in getting the vote in Idaho. So she traverses all around the Northwest, and she knows that she's the most important suffragist, and she knows that she has all the history. And so she becomes very authoritarian. And of all things, Abigail Scott Duniway, as the newer suffragists come in, right? So Abigail Scott Duniway, Cross the Plains, is, you know, represents women of a certain age. But to get suffrage across the line is going to take, is going to make that people, another generation of feminists is going to come in, of suffragists, right? And so here's the interesting thing about Abigail Scott Duniway. She is anti-temperance. And so she says, oh my God, you can't be talking about temperance and want men to give us the right to vote, because they won't give women the right to vote as long as women are on the temperance bandwagon. So you've got to stop that. Well, that doesn't really work for Portland and Vancouver women, by the way, because guess what? These are temperance women, and they are really, really strong temperance women. And so she has, there's this extraordinary and wonderful local story. Now, I don't know if any of you know about the Athenaeum, Athenian Club. I'm not pronouncing. Athenaeum Club. This was a club of women who had gained together, and women, especially Vancouver women, they were great clubbers, right? And so again, more with privileged women, women who got a lot of education, got a lot of moxie, and don't know exactly what to do with it. So the Federation of Women's Clubs comes. There are all kinds of clubs, but there is a club in Vancouver, and in I'm trying to remember what it was. Yeah, it's how can I be forgetting this? I'm pretty sure it's formed in 1895, but I think this happens in something like maybe 1905. I'm sorry that I'm bad. I'm usually good at my numbers. I'm off my slides. But I do want to tell you this story. The entire club disbands. And they're furious at the president of the club. And the funny thing is I've done all this research. I know women in the club. I know all kinds of things. I know about how they actually disbanded rather than letting Abigail Scott Duniway come. But I don't know who the president is, who was the troublemaker, although I have a theory going on. So if any of you, I would like to volunteer to be a docent, I told you, for any of you at the Historical Society. So we'll get some small groups going, and you'll go with me, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these backstories. In Clark County, the women formed the Equal Rights Association in 1883. The women and men formed the Equal Rights Association. And remember that Washington, for a short period of time, has suffrage in 1883. So our locals here immediately get going with an Equal Rights Association. And one of the lucky things is I actually have the entire membership. That's at the Historical Society. So that was a detail that we could get. And so when I was even doing some of my trying to figure out how to find certain of these people, knowing whether they were members of the Equal Rights Association was very exciting. And so, by the way, if any of you with your genealogy and you would like to get in touch with me, I will get this document to you. I think there are about 30 members. And if any of you have your local, ancestors, you'd like to know this. Their leaders were Mary Jane Bean Hayden, Miss Ella Whipple, and Elizabeth Durgan. Ella Whipple is an absolutely amazing woman. She is the she gets this is the Whipple family from Ridgefield and Whipple Creek Park. They move into Vancouver for their children's education, and their children actually go to Willamette University. So that's a thing to know. I'm going to talk to you about the Methodist connection. People really like to go to Willamette. But she becomes one of the first superintendent of the local schools. at the same time that she's a superintendent of the school of the Normal Institute, the Teacher Training Institute. And she also gets her MD at Willamette University at the same time that she's doing all these things. And she's also the #1 temperance leader in town. She and the whole Whipple family will move to California, to Southern California, in the early 1900s. So their gain is our loss. And Elizabeth Durgan, and some of you I know are going to be related to the large Durgan family. And Elizabeth Durgan is one of the most interesting of the early suffragists. And so I want to tell you that there also is a Durgan. And all of us in genealogy know this problem with spelling. But in this particular case, they actually come across the plains and they are in the same family. And one of the family members decides to spell it Gin, and one of the other family members decides to spell it Gan. But the more progressive ones are the Gin. Mary Jane Bean Hayden. So Mary Jane Bean Hayden, she crosses the plains at age 18 when she is pregnant. By the way, this is how pregnant she is. She gives birth to the twins just about right after her arrival. Yes, this is Hayden Island, if you were wondering who the founders of Hayden Island are. And she is going to be the #1 suffragist of the National Americanist Women's Suffrage Organization. And what is fun is she has this book, Pioneer Days, and you can get this. I actually ordered it online. And I think I even got it from Amazon or something like that. And so it's really wonderful to read her particular story, and her story of she's on a raft going over, the Dalles. She is a good friend of Abigail Stott Dunaway, and she is a treasurer of the CCERA, the Equal Rights Association. So one of the frustrating things, when we are trying to find the locations and the addresses of many of these early people, and we can find their addresses, but so many of them are in I-5. Wow, did I-5 do a number on beautiful homes? And I know that the Hayden home was right on the edge of the Officers Row. So as I'm thinking, right, that means it's either like where that Department of Transportation is right there, or in fact, smack dab in the middle of I-5. Frances Willard is important to women in Clark County. She is the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Organization, and she is brilliant. She comes up with this idea, which is called the do everything policy. And what she says is, you must work for temperance, but we also must get the right to vote. And why must we get the right to vote? So that we can vote in the 18th Amendment, the prohibition. And she says, you must do everything, make speeches, write letters, make signs. And that is a wonderful thing for the women in Vancouver. And so the women in Vancouver formed the WCTU in 1877. So the progressiveness which is going on for women in the West Coast also is a really strong thing on temperance. Now, why would there be more progressive nature on the West Coast? Well, life was terrible here, and I can't tell you guys that, or I don't mean terrible, dangerous. You might lose your partner going across the plains. You might lose your partner in an accident, right? Life was very, very fragile. So it was not practical to not give women any rights, especially property rights. You needed to give women property rights on the West Coast. You needed to give them a number of rights, because otherwise, if something happened to the man, things could definitely fall apart, right? There is not another system. So we are always more progressive here. If we think about progressivism as not including something like temperance, that would not exactly be correct. So the thing that I want to mention is, do understand that, let's say the husband is a drunk, and this woman has absolutely no rights, and she has no way to get out of this. And She wants the right to divorce. She wants the right for inheritance. Her father wants her to have the right to inheritance. So I want to mention something kind of interesting to you. So let's say your son-in-law is a drunk and it's a disaster. If you are the father, you, by the way, are going to become a suffrage advocate because you want your daughter to have more rights. She's not in a really good situation, and you particularly don't want her husband to inherit everything. Who knows what he might do with it? In Vancouver, the center of action is the Methodist Episcopal Church. And I think most of you know, don't you? Or if you do not, the Methodist Church was known as the Methodist Episcopal Church for a pretty long time. I think someone here probably knows better than I do, but I think it's into, Susan B. Anthony is speaking in 1896, and it's still called the Methodist Episcopal Church. And in Portland, it is at the big Methodist church that the big conferences and everything go on. So Methodists are very involved with progressivism. And again, holy smokes, the two biggest speakers of all came to our town, Vancouver. Frances Willard comes in 1883, and no wonder she comes, and she's supposed to be just an unbelievable speaker. And she blows everybody's mind. And Susan B. Anthony, who is not a mind-blowing speaker, but an effective one, will come. So how much time have I got? Is this end at 8 or what time? What's my timing now? It's 12 minutes to 8. Eric, would you come in and give me a time?
You can continue as long as you need.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't want to go on, and I have a ton of slides. I'm going to talk with you about some things that are going to go on. I think this is an exciting and fun story then. So then I'm just going to go on. As we're looking, now I'm national. So I was local and I'm going back to national. I want to just tell you some of the things that are going on nationally. So the old guard is what you see in blue in the slide here on the right-hand side. And that would be called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. They are thinking the only way we're going to pass this is by state. We have no luck in passing this in Congress. We are ladies. We are ladylike. We don't do wild and crazy things. I don't know if you've heard about them in Britain. They're breaking windows. They're going on hunger strikes. All kinds of things are happening. We don't do that kind of thing. Much more conservative. Their colors are yellow and white, and the color of the League of Women Voters is blue. Mrs. Cherry Catman Cat's favorite color. Will become the League of Women Voters, which, by the way, has blue as its background. The Women's Party is going to become a very big player, and it represents younger women. So now you're the next guard, right? You are the women who are going to get this happening. So when were you born? Somewhere around the turn of the century, or somewhere, around there. And these younger women say, we don't want to wait around and be ladylike anymore. We want a constitutional amendment. Alice Paul is going to form the Women's Party, which I'm going to talk to you about in just a moment. They have many younger women. I don't know how many of you have seen me here. Do you see I've got my Votes for Women? And so if you saw me marching, you'd say she's from the National Women's Party, because I've got my purple and my gold. If I was wearing white with a yellow sash, I would be part of the more conservative group. So colors are very important to people. This is kind of an interesting thing to mention. And here is a wonderful poster. I've jumped around a little bit because I have some really great examples too of poster art. But when women, there are some big givers who are giving nationally to the movement. And I want to just take a moment and tell you, the social networking of the time was posters. And these wonderful, wonderful imagery were just going on everywhere. And was really an important part of getting the message across. And you see here a great hero who I feel like in this last year has been totally ignored and to a shocking nature, and that is Carrie Chapman Catt, who is the founder of the League of Women Voters. This is her right about around 1920. She is conciliatory in terms of working with government, but make no mistake about it, Carrie Chapman Catt, who by the way was chosen by Susan B. Anthony to be her successor, and Carrie Chapman Catt succeeds Susan B. Anthony in the national work. Her husband dies, and she re-enters the suffrage movement as the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1915, and she pulls it across. She is, anyway, just an absolutely remarkable woman. And what she is going to go on to do, by the way, is to be one of the founders of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, is where she will go. Now, Alice Paul is the young woman who transforms and changes everything. She is the person who begins militant direct action. And what I want to tell you that's exciting to me, because I think that as a person who loves history, viewing progressive and protest movements through the 20th century, most of the ideas that people had, including in the civil rights movement, they all got, by the way, from Alice Paul. So direct action means I'm in your face, which is, of course, what ladies are not supposed to do. And she creates spectacles. That's what she calls it, spectacles. Because what is your social networking? It's doing something nutty enough to get in the newspaper, right? That's what you've got to do. And she also, pioneers this opposition. So I have this funny phrase here that I got from another place, but opposition campaigning through iconic imagery. And the iconic imagery that she's really interested in is men, policemen roughing up women. Men, police guards roughing up women. Because you know what? That's horrifying, isn't it? Oh my God. Remember, this is at the turn of the century. She's going to challenge all notions of gender propriety. She was a Quaker. Extraordinary willpower, just an amazing woman who is completely beloved by her supporters. And she forms what's known as the National Women's Party. And I have to tell you that I just want to mention to some of you who might be collectors and running into any of these kinds of things. Again, when you see the purple on it, purple and gold like this, that's where you know what you're collecting. So Western women in the progressive West are going to get the vote first because it's only that practical. And I have a little trivia question. Who knows what state gave women the right to vote first? Anybody want to unmute yourself and shout it out?
Wyoming.
Yep. I knew this group. I knew this. So yes, Wyoming is number 1. And again, remember, we are number 5. California took a while. So, and look at this one again. Don't you love this art? So here she's, she's coming and she's saying, "I'm coming to help you women in the East." And so this is the kind of thing that they're doing in order to get suffrage going. And then what Alice Paul is doing is setting up spectacles. And so here are women who are picketing at the White House. There are also going to be plenty of women picketing and causing spectacles. They even, by the way, wrap themselves. Do you know what they do? They wrap themselves in blankets. See how they look fairly slim here. But one of their things to do when they know they're going to be beat up is that they'll wrap themselves in blankets. And Alice Paul is the number 1 person who also is going to be arrested. And when these women get arrested, they go on hunger strikes. Now, hunger strikes are horrifying to the American public. And so you have to get this information out. the hunger strikes are really making a difference. And so what happens, and they start in Britain and they also come over here. And what happens is a very old and traumatic version of a nasogastric tube is, so women are actually tied down because they clench their teeth, right? You know, you're not going to get any food in me. And they are tied to a chair, and 2 times a day, a very old version of a nasogastric tube is shoved down their, you know, nose and goes into their gut. And they're given like a combination of scrambled eggs and dairy products and kind of soft things like that. And so this little pin is Alice Paul's Jailed for Freedom pin. And boy, there, you know, if Alice Paul gives you this because you were jailed, that's a that's a wonderful thing. So Congress is going to pass the 19th Amendment, and the ratification is going on. Here is Alice Paul with the Women's Party. I was telling you about her. And so look, see how they're all young women around her. They really love her. She's looking at ratification. She has some very wealthy people who are giving her money, very, very wealthy. Have you ever heard of the Belmont family, you know, the Belmont Stakes and all that, all that Belmont money went into suffrage because of a widow. And it's right across from the White House, by the way. So they can go right out to the White House and cause all of their mischief, and then they sneak back in their house. But on in August 1920, the very last state is up for ratification. And is it going to happen or not? Remember, I told you that if we were in March, Washington, 35th, there are now a number of states that are saying no to this. And they have gotten down to August 18th. Well, I got to tell you a story. It doesn't get better than this, so you just got to listen to it. So here's Harry Byrne. Have you heard of him? He was a very young legislator, and boy, whereas he hardly knew what to do about ratification, because he was very wanting to get ahead. And there seemed to be a great deal of people in this is the Tennessee legislature, who is number 36. And he is wearing a red rose on his lapel as he walks into the State House. And the suffrage women who are putting their numbers together are really distraught, because if you wear a red rose, it means you're going to go against the 19th Amendment. And if you wear a yellow rose, you will be for them. So Harry Byrne waits, and he is actually one of the very last legislators to come up to vote. And he gets up and he takes 2 things out of his pocket. One of them is a yellow rose, and he unpins the red rose and he pins the yellow rose on. And then he takes a letter out of his pocket and he says, "My mother wrote me last night. Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Harry, don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. I know that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow," he explained, "and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. So it's passed." Now, there are a number of interesting candidates who are already running in Clark County, because remember, in Washington, our women can vote. And they would have these voter cards out here. If you were to go to the Historical Society, we could really talk a lot about some of the early women who were elected. But Elizabeth Sterling, who also founded the American Association for University Women here in town, founding member of. But she was the superintendent of schools. She was the very first woman elected after suffrage. And in 1920, she becomes the deputy county clerk of Vancouver. So on the whole, that's that's when women are going. So, and then my last one, and I'm getting, so get ready for the questions, which I hope you will ask me. Alice Paul, the person who I had talked with you before, was the person who first wrote the ERA. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of sex. And this has not passed yet. So I'm done. Can you believe it? Questions?
Unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd like to.
And even if it's one about one of your relatives, you know, one of your ancestors, your relatives.
One thing I think is interesting is that it didn't really address a couple of categories of women. If they were married to an alien, at least up to that point, they lost their citizenship and their ability to vote. And then I don't know about Native American when they acquired the ability to vote.
Good point, Elsie, in a very long time, by the way. And I don't know exactly what year, but we kept Native people from voting for an unbelievably long time. Well,
I guess you answered everybody's questions.
it appears that it appears that actually probably people are just absolutely like, whoa, this is a lot of information. So the last thing though that I want you to ask me, and I really want to tell, in fact, is this the chat? Do I just click on the chat? Okay, here, and I should probably in the chat, I am going to put in my email address. And I would be delighted to meet up with any of you at the museum.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a great presentation, and thank you for the willingness to meet people at the museum and give them a special tour.
I just wanted to mention that Mary Jane Hayden's book is on the new bookshelf at our library.
Oh, it is?
Yes, and it is a very good book. It's a very short one. It's a fast read,
Yeah.
so you go down there and read it in a half hour.
Yeah, it's just spectacular. Her personality really comes through. And now the History Museum, I don't know, I think it's something like 15, you know, no more than 15 people. There are 20 panels, and they do, I'm not talking to you about Native women in this, but they go everything from what was going on at the Hudson's Bay Company to the officers, and, you know, what were the roles of women, right? Laundresses, and there were, you know, women could figure things out through the military. And then really some interesting things about elected women, about women who were fantastic, like Leah Hing, the aviator, and some of the extraordinary women. So you'll just love it. Everyone here I know is just, I think many of you are just like me, that it's so valuable.
Yeah, quick question. How did Clark County vote on women's suffrage?
Clark County did vote for women's suffrage. And these are the years, you know, where we've got those really progressive parties and everything like that. You know, there's a really strong, you know, the IWW is really strong here. There's a lot, the Granges, so the Granges are behind this. But Clark County didn't vote for it for many, many years. And really it took that same number, and really it probably, I think it just kind of squeaked through in 1910, but we passed too. Yeah. And of course, as everyone knows, it's Clark with an E at the time. And so, when you write things like this, can I tell you, Brad Richardson at the History Museum, we were talking about this because it should have an E in here, right? Elected Clark County in 1911. And when you do something like write these panels, you're trying to figure out how you should do it, because if it's accurate, it's going to be, what is it, about somewhere like in the 20s, isn't it, that that the E gets dropped? So, oh no, look, here she's the superintendent. Wait a minute. Wait. It says Clark County without an E here. So look at me. What is this? I think this is, so if this is her card, so it must be around the turn of the century when they dropped the E.
Well, thank you again for a pretty quick and thorough overview of the progress of women's suffrage in the US as well as Clark County. We appreciate your doing that.